The Mediterranean in 1940, it was a deadly chessboard where empires collided. Driven by the dream of a resurrected Roman Empire, Benito Mussolini sought to transform these waters into a private Italian lake, deploying the fastest cruisers in the world to sever the lifelines of the Allied cause. But when Italian arrogance met Australian discipline, the result was a clash that defied all expectations. This is the story of how a single ship from a young nation, half a world away, challenged the myth of Italian speed and rewrote the rules of naval warfare in the shadow of Cape Spada. By July 1940, the azure waters of the Mediterranean Sea had been transformed into a high-stakes theater of war. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, viewed this vast maritime expanse as a central pillar for his dream of a resurrected Roman Empire. He famously referred to the sea as Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea, signaling his intent to dominate every shipping lane from Gibraltar to the Suez Canal. For the Italian Royal Navy, known as the Regia Marina, the start of World War II was not just a military obligation, but a moment of supreme confidence. They possessed a fleet that was the envy of many nations, characterized by elegant designs and, most importantly, unparalleled speed. The centerpiece of Mussolini's maritime strategy was the deployment of condottieri-class light cruisers. These vessels were engineered with a single purpose in mind: to outrun any opponent they could not outgun. With some ships capable of reaching staggering speeds of over 40 knots, the Italian leadership believed they held the ultimate advantage in a sea where mobility was the key to survival. They intended to use this speed to intercept Allied convoys, severing the vital arteries that kept the British Empire alive in North Africa and the Middle East. To the planners in Rome, the Mediterranean was a private Italian lake where Allied ships would be hunted down by the fastest predators afloat. However, the arrogance of the fascist leadership overlooked a critical factor. While their ships were fast and visually magnificent, they were often lightly armored to save weight for those powerful engines. This design philosophy created a glass jaw that could be shattered by a determined and accurate opponent. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test whether Italian speed could overcome the seasoned professional skills of a combined Allied force. This clash, which history would record as the Battle of Cape Spada, began as a routine mission for both sides but quickly escalated into a definitive test of naval doctrine. At the center of the Allied response was a ship from a distant continent. HMAS Sydney, a Leander-class light cruiser of the Royal Australian Navy, was a vessel built for endurance and precision rather than record-breaking sprints. Under the command of Captain John Collins, the Sydney and its crew represented the quiet confidence of the Australian military tradition. They were operating in the Mediterranean to support the British Mediterranean Fleet, yet they maintained a distinct national identity. For the Australians, the Mediterranean was not a playground for imperial dreams, but a battlefield where discipline and accuracy would be the only currency that mattered. As Mussolini's fast cruisers prepared to sweep the sea of its enemies, they were unaware that they were about to sail into a trap set by an opponent who valued the cold reality of marksmanship over the flash of a high-speed hull. The chessboard was ready, and the first move was about to be made off the rugged coast of Crete. The dawn broke over the Aegean Sea. 4 British destroyers, including HMS Hyperion, Ilex, Hero, and Hasty, were conducting a routine anti-submarine patrol in the Antikythera Strait. This small flotilla was far from its main base and seemingly isolated in the vast Mediterranean. However, unknown to the British crews, 2 Italian light cruisers were steaming toward them at high speed. These were the Bartolomeo Colleoni and the Bandineri, 2 of the fastest ships in the Italian fleet. Commanded by Rear Admiral Ferdinando Casardi, the Italian squadron had been dispatched from Tripoli to intercept Allied shipping and establish Italian dominance in the waters surrounding Crete. When the 2 forces sighted each other at approximately 07:20 a.m., the tactical situation appeared heavily skewed in favor of the Italians. The Italian light cruisers possessed significantly larger guns and higher speeds than the small British destroyers. To the Italian commanders, the 4 destroyers looked like easy prey, a minor obstacle to be brushed aside by the superior firepower of the Regia Marina. As the first Italian shells began to splash into the water, the British destroyers immediately turned away to the northeast. This maneuver looked like a desperate flight for survival, but it was in fact a masterfully executed tactical retreat. The British captains were following a prearranged plan to lure the Italian cruisers into a specific area where a much more formidable force was waiting. Captain John Collins on HMAS Sydney, along with the destroyer HMS Havoc, was positioned roughly 40 miles to the north. As the four British destroyers fled, they maintained a precise course that drew the Italian pursuers deeper into the trap. The Italians, eager to secure a quick and glorious victory, increased their speed to close the distance. They were so focused on the retreating destroyers that they failed to realize they were being led directly toward a predator lurking just over the horizon. Throughout this pursuit, the tension grew as the distance between the Italian guns and the British destroyers remained dangerously close. The Italian cruisers were pushing their engines to the limit, their sleek hulls slicing through the waves as they chased what they believed to be a retreating enemy. Admiral Casardi felt confident that his superior speed would soon bring him within decisive range. Little did he know that the Australian cruiser Sydney was already closing in from the north at full speed. By maintaining the pursuit, the Italians were inadvertently cutting off their own path of escape and walking into a pincer movement. The British destroyers had played their part perfectly, acting as the irresistible bait that would soon bring the fastest cruisers of Mussolini into the deadly sights of the Australian gunners. The stage was now set for the most dramatic intervention of the early naval war in the Mediterranean. As the Italian cruisers Bartolomeo Colleoni and Bandinere continued their aggressive pursuit of the British destroyers, they remained blissfully unaware of the catastrophe approaching from their flank. The Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney was racing southward at top speed, yet it remained invisible to Italian eyes and ears. This was not a result of luck, but of a brilliant tactical decision by Captain John Collins. He had ordered his ship to maintain absolute radio silence and had deactivated all signal-emitting equipment. By refusing to broadcast any messages, the Sydney effectively disappeared from the electronic landscape of the Mediterranean. While the Italians relied on their superior speed to hunt the British destroyers, they neglected to account for a hidden adversary approaching from an unexpected direction. Captain Collins understood that the element of surprise was his greatest weapon against ships that could easily outrun him in a fair chase. By approaching from the north under a veil of silence, the Sydney became a ghost ship, moving through the waves without a whisper of its presence, reaching the Italian Admiral Casardi. The Italian crews were so preoccupied with the targets in front of them that they failed to scan the northern horizon for new threats. The technical contrast between the opposing forces was stark. The Italian Condottieri-class cruisers were designed for the glamour of speed, reaching up to 40 knots. They were beautiful machines of war, but their thin armor made them vulnerable to sustained fire. HMS Sydney was a different kind of predator. It was a Leander-class light cruiser built for durability and steady performance. It did not possess the flashy speed of the Italians, but it carried a crew of some of the most highly trained and disciplined gunners in the world. The Australians had spent countless hours perfecting their marksmanship, and they were ready to prove that precision was more valuable than velocity. The moment of realization for the Italian fleet was sudden and terrifying. At 8:29 a.m., the silence was shattered not by a radio signal, but by the thunderous roar of Sydney's 6-inch guns. The first salvos fell from the sky like a hammer blow, the massive splashes of water appearing remarkably close to the Italian hulls. The Italians were stunned to find a fresh cruiser suddenly blocking their path and cutting off their retreat. They had expected an easy hunt of small destroyers, but they were now facing a determined Australian warship that had appeared as if from nowhere. The ghost from the north had arrived, and the Italians found themselves caught in a deadly pincer movement. Their pride in their speed was about to be tested by the cold and calculated reality of Australian naval power. The arrival of HMAS Sydney on the scene changed the nature of the engagement, from a pursuit into a fierce artillery duel. However, this was not a battle fought at close quarters. Captain John Collins ordered his gunners to open fire at a staggering distance of approximately 18,000 to 20,000 yards. At this extreme range, the ships on the horizon appeared as little more than tiny gray specks against the vast blue of the Mediterranean. To hit a moving target from such a distance while both vessels were traveling at high speeds required a level of mathematical precision and steady nerves that only the most elite crews possessed. The Australian gunners proved they were up to the challenge. While the Italian ships Bartolomeo Colleoni and Bandinere possessed a significant advantage in raw speed, that very speed became a liability during the exchange of fire. As the Italian cruisers pushed their engines to their limits to maneuver, The extreme vibrations and the frantic rocking of their narrow, lightly built hulls made accurate range finding nearly impossible for their crews. The Italian return fire was rapid but scattered, with shells falling harmlessly into the sea far from the Australian cruiser. The Italian philosophy of prioritizing speed over stability was failing them in the one moment where accuracy mattered most. In contrast, the crew of the Sydney remained remarkably calm and methodical. The Australian gunnery officers utilized their optical rangefinders with chilling efficiency, compensating for the wind and the movement of the sea. Despite the intense heat and the deafening roar of the 6-inch turrets, the rhythm of the Sydney remained steady and cold. The ship acted as a stable platform for its guns, and the Australian shells began to straddle the Italian targets with terrifying consistency. This was a salutation of fire that announced the arrival of a world-class naval power from the Southern Hemisphere. The psychological impact of this long-range bombardment was profound. The Italian sailors who had expected to be the hunters suddenly found themselves under an accurate and relentless barrage from an enemy they could barely see. Every few seconds, the horizon would flash, and another set of shells would scream through the air toward them. The Australians were not merely firing at the Italians. They were conducting a masterclass in naval gunnery. This phase of the Battle of Cape Spada demonstrated that in the modern era of naval warfare, the ability to strike first and strike accurately from a distance was far more important than the ability to run fast. As the Sydney closed the range slightly, the precision of its fire only increased, preparing the way for a decisive blow that would change the course of the battle forever. As the duel intensified, the relentless accuracy of the Australian gunners began to take a heavy toll on the lead Italian ship. At approximately 9:23 a.m., the world was reminded that in naval combat, a single well-placed shell can outweigh an entire fleet of faster vessels. One of Sydney's 6-inch shells, fired with lethal precision from thousands of yards away, found its mark with devastating consequences. The projectile tore through the thin armor of the Bartolomeo Colleoni and penetrated deep into the heart of the ship, striking the forward boiler room and engine compartment. The result was an immediate and catastrophic loss of power. The ship that had been hailed as the fastest cruiser in the world, a marvel of Italian engineering designed to fly across the waves at 40 knots, was suddenly transformed into a helpless and stationary mass of steel. The massive engines that had been the pride of Mussolini's navy fell silent, and the ship lost all steerage. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, and black smoke began to billow from the damaged hull as the vessel drifted aimlessly in the water. For the crew of the Colleoni, the very speed they had relied upon for protection had vanished in a single minute of fire. Captain John Collins did not allow his crew to hesitate. Seeing the enemy ship dead in the water, the Sydney continued to pour a steady stream of fire into the crippled cruiser. The Australian shells systematically dismantled the upper works and turrets of the Colleoni, ensuring that the vessel could no longer offer any meaningful resistance. Despite the damage, the Italian sailors fought bravely, but they were trapped on a platform that could no longer move or effectively fight back. The Australian gunners remained cold and methodical, executing their duty with a professional detachment that underscored their superiority in this engagement. With the Bartolomeo Colleoni neutralized and unable to escape, the final task of sinking the vessel was handed to the British destroyers. The small ships that had previously acted as bait now moved in for the kill. They raced toward the stationary cruiser, launching a series of torpedoes that hissed through the water toward the doomed Italian ship. The torpedoes struck home, tearing massive holes in the hull and causing the sea to rush into the lower decks. At 9:59 a.m., the pride of the Regia Marina rolled over and began its final journey to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The destruction of the Colleoni was a stark message to Rome. Speed was a hollow defense against the iron discipline and superior marksmanship of the Australian Navy. The fastest ship in the world had been outthought and outfought, leaving its sister ship to face a desperate choice. As the Bartolomeo Colleoni began its final plunge into the depths, its sister ship, the Bandinere, was left to face the full fury of the Australian cruiser. The Bandinere was technically a more powerful and modern vessel, yet the sight of its comrade being reduced to a burning wreck had a devastating effect on the Italian command. Rather than closing the distance to engage the Sydney in a decisive battle of light cruisers, Admiral Casardi made the immediate decision to withdraw. The grand ambition of dominating the Mediterranean was replaced by a singular, desperate urge to survive. The retreat of the Bande Nere was a moment of deep irony. The ship had arrived at the battle with an air of invincible elegance, boasting sleek lines and a reputation for unmatched velocity. Now it was forced to use that very speed, not to hunt, but to flee in total humiliation. To shield itself from the relentless Australian fire, the Italian cruiser began to emit massive clouds of thick black smoke, creating a desperate artificial fog to hide its movements. The pride of the Italian Navy was literally running for its life, zigzagging across the water as it headed for the safety of its bases in the Dodecanese Islands. Captain John Collins and the crew of the Sydney were not content to let the second predator escape so easily. Despite the grueling hours of combat already behind them, the Australians maintained a high-speed pursuit. The Sydney chased the Bandonniere for miles, its guns continuing to bark as they sent shell after shell screaming toward the retreating Italian hull. The Australian gunners remained focused, their shells falling so close to the Bandonniere that the Italian ship was frequently hidden by the massive geysers of water erupting from near misses. One of these shells eventually found its target, striking the Bandonniere and causing significant damage, though not enough to slow the vessel down to a halt. The chase only came to an end because of a practical reality. The Sydney was running out of ammunition. The intensity of the engagement at Cape Spada had seen the Australian cruiser expend nearly its entire stock of 6-inch shells. With his magazines almost empty and the Bandonniere utilizing its superior speed to finally pull away into the distance, Captain Collins gave the order to break off the pursuit. The results of the encounter were staggering. One of Mussolini's finest cruisers lay at the bottom of the sea, while the other was limping home in disgrace. On the Australian side, the victory was nearly bloodless. The Sydney had suffered only a single minor injury among its crew, despite being targeted by hundreds of Italian shells. The contrast was complete. The flamboyant Italian fleet had been shattered by the quiet, professional, and lethal efficiency of a ship from a young nation half a world away. The news of the engagement off Cape Spada sent shockwaves through the naval headquarters in Rome and the political halls of the Villa Torlonia. Benito Mussolini was reportedly stunned and infuriated by the outcome. He had invested heavily in a fleet that prioritized speed and aesthetic brilliance, believing that these modern vessels would easily sweep the British and their allies from the Mediterranean. To see one of his fastest cruisers at the bottom of the sea and another retreating in shame was a staggering blow to fascist prestige. The battle proved that the Mediterranean was far from an Italian lake, and that the boasted velocity of the Regia Marina was no substitute for the cold reality of superior naval gunnery and tactical grit. In London and across the Allied world, the victory provided a much-needed boost to morale during a dark period of the war. However, it was in Australia that the news sparked a wave of unprecedented national pride. Canberra erupted in celebration as the details of the Sydney's exploits were released to the public. For a young nation still carving out its own identity on the global stage, the Battle of Cape Spada was a defining moment. It proved that the Royal Australian Navy was not merely an auxiliary branch or a shadow of the British Royal Navy, but an independent, elite, and highly capable force. The symbolic weight of HMAS Sydney became a cornerstone of the Australian war effort. The victory demonstrated that Australian sailors could go head-to-head with the best fleets in Europe and emerge triumphant through sheer skill and discipline. Captain John Collins became a national hero, embodying the calm and professional spirit of the Australian military. The battle showed that while Australia was small in population, its military reach and effectiveness were world-class. The Sydney was no longer just a ship, it was a floating piece of Australian territory that had humbled a superpower in its own backyard. Military analysts around the globe began to study the battle to understand how a single cruiser had defeated a superior force. The consensus was clear. The Australians had won because they possessed a superior understanding of the human element in naval warfare. While the Italians had focused on the machines and their top speeds, the Australians had focused on the men and their ability to function under pressure. The precision of the Australian fire at 18 kilometers remained a topic of awe among naval officers for years. This encounter redefined the reputation of the Australian digger as being just as formidable at sea as he was on land. In the aftermath of Cape Spada, the name of HMAS Sydney was etched into the annals of naval history. serving as a permanent reminder that in the deadly game of maritime chess, a well-trained hand will always defeat a fast but poorly guided piece.